be back with more news. And from Mayor, Nationalization of Iranian Oil Industry. Led by Prime Minister Mossadegh and religious figures such as Ayatollah Khashoggi, the nationalization of Iran's oil entered a new phase on Esfand 29, or March 20th, after the Majlis passed the related legislation. The movement sought to cut the hands of Britain that was exploiting Iran's oil and giving a tiny portion back to the country. London could not tolerate such a movement for many reasons, and hence set the stage for a coup against Mossadegh 2 years later with the cooperation of the United States. Western companies had been involved in the extraction of oil in Iran and other countries in the Middle East since extraction had become technically and financially feasible. By the end of the 1940s, there was a growing resentment in Iran to the huge imbalance in oil revenues that the British government and the Iranian government were receiving from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, formerly the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Similarly, arrangements between the U.S. and countries such as Saudi Arabia seemed more equitable, and in 1950 Britain offered a new concession to Iraq with regard to oil revenue. This fueled a surge in anti-British rhetoric, with the leader of the National Front of Iran, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, leading calls to end foreign influence in Iran and nationalizing the industry. This call was supported by Ayatollah Khashoggi, a leading cleric, and Mossadegh was made prime minister in March 1951 after the previous prime minister had been assassinated. Mossadegh then moved quickly. On 15 March 1951, he passed a law nationalizing IOC with immediate effect, which was verified by the Iranian parliament 2 days later. He gave all British employees of AIOC a week to leave the country, and Ayatollah Khashoggi even declared a national day of hatred against the British government. Sanctions followed, and the move galvanized the British to help orchestrate the overthrow of Mossadegh in June 1953. Nonetheless, the decision to stand up to Western domination and determine its own future in such a way is seen as a key event in the history of
officials say lies some.
In the first year of the nationalization, the only foreign sale of Iranian oil was 300 barrels to an Italian merchant ship. Foreign oil companies prevented any impacts of the Iranian withdrawal from being felt by consumer countries by increasing output elsewhere. Oil production was expanded by BP and Aramco in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. Oil production in the Middle East increased by around 10% annually in 1951, 52, and 53. With Iranian oil production decreasing from 242 million barrels in 1950 to 10.6 million barrels in 1952, the loss of oil exports severely impacted the economy. In August 1953, the government of Mossadegh was overthrown by a military coup d'etat orchestrated by the United States Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in prison and then kept under house arrest until his death in 1967. After the coup, the Iranian oil crisis ended, and the AIOC did not succeed to stop production. The National Iranian Oil Company as an international consortium was founded, and the AIOC was made a member. Iran, self-sufficient in constructing oil gas refineries. Delivering a speech during ceremony marking the anniversary of Iran's oil industry nationalization to inaugurate the first part of the second phase of a project aimed at increasing and sustaining Abadan refinery's production capacity, the minister said 31 semi-finished projects valued at $12 billion were put into operation in the Iranian calendar March 21st, 2022, or the year 1401. The Ministry of Petroleum and the nation, Iranian Oil Refining and Distribution Company, have given top priority to to the completion of partly finished and national projects, said Augie, adding the newly inaugurated project was among them, which has made 64% progress when the incumbent administration took office, and the remaining 36% work was done in 18 months. More than 100 contractors participated in the project completion process, mentioned Augie, continuing that the most complicated job of Abadan Refinery Phase 2 was done in an unprecedented measure during the period, while oil exports had decreased and further sanctions had been imposed on the country when President Ibrahim Raisi took office. Shifting to the incumbent administration's energy diplomacy, the minister said some $5 million of foreign investments have been so far attracted to develop oil and gas fields. The country signed gas contracts with other countries, stated LG, referring to the settlement of the issue with Turkmenistan, whose relations with Iran had been strained for 5 years, and adding the volume of exchanging gas between the two countries has doubled. He also pointed to the employment of 900 elites of the Petroleum University of Technology, indigenization of technology or of technical know-how, and achievement of self-sufficiency in the construction of petrochemical plants, petrorefineries, and supplementary industries. The number of knowledge-based companies whose expertise is used by the government has soared from 150 to 550, added the minister. Haji said Iran's currently producing over 3 million barrels of oil per day, vowing 2 more refineries will become operational in the new Iranian calendar year, starting March 21st, 2023, to increase the country's refining capacity. Concluding his remarks, he said $260 million have been allotted to Phase 3 of Abadan Refinery. Iran says ready for new investment in its oil sector. A statement issued late on Sunday comes days after senior Saudi Arabian officials said his country would be ready for quick investment in Iranian development projects. Without naming any country or company, the oil ministry said any offer for investment in Iranian oil and gas projects, especially from members of the OPEC alliance of oil-producing nations, would be welcome in Tehran. It said any such investment would benefit the global security, as Iran is a leading holder of oil and gas reserves in the world, Press TV reported. Saudi Arabia is the largest oil exporter in the world and a leading member in the OPEC Plus grouping, which consists of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and allies like Russia. Iran is the third largest natural gas producer in the world and still a key supplier of crude oil to Asian markets, despite being subject to sanctions imposed by the U.S. since 2018. Political authorities from Iran and Saudi Arabia announced earlier this month in the Chinese capital, Beijing, that the two countries will restore their diplomatic relations by reopening embassies that had been closed in 2016. And the Iranian Minister of Energy, Morteza Shah Mirzai. Here's a clip from an interview with him.
Hello and welcome everybody.
At the outset, I wish to convey the greetings of all oil industrialists and all the technicians and engineers in the oil industry to all Iranians across the globe and all those who celebrate Nowruz. Today is the Oil Nationalization Day. It's an important day for the oil industry, and it's an important day for all those who operate in the oil industry across the globe. And this is an important event since it refers to the nationalization of the oil industry. So this is a major event in our history. It dates back to 72 years ago when the Iranian people and the technicians were after nationalizing the oil industry and also received the oil revenue. 114 years ago, when the first oil well was constructed in Masjid Suleiman, At that time, the British were in charge of the oil, and till 1329 Iranian calendar, there were some uprisings, and Nawab Safavi, as one of the employees of Abadan refinery, he stood in the face of this apartheid, and it also affected the parliament, and eventually on this date, with the efforts made by all the patriots, particularly the workers of the oil industry, the oil was nationalized at the Oil Commission of the Parliament, and since that time, all the technicians made efforts in order to have more value added from the oil industry. So this trend continued till the triumph of the Islamic Revolution, and many advisors from the US and US allies were present in Iran, and they were operating in our oil industry. With the victory of the revolution, they stopped working and they left our country. And we have a 12,000-year background. It's an honor for us. Many countries take our artifacts, take them to their museums, and they're proud of it. This indicates our rich historical background. And in the past 10 to 15 centuries, we have made a great deal of efforts, and we had this historical background till 1979, when the foreign advisors left the country, and at that time, domestic experts started operating the oil industry, and the production of oil and gas, petrochemical products, the production of these items were not halted even for a single day. It was the same after the outbreak of the war. And even though many of our oil and gas fields and our petrochemical hubs, and we had the petrochemical hub in Mahshar, it was attacked by the Ba'athist enemy. All our refinery oil and petrochemical units were operating, and we continued our exports. This indicates the glory and courage of the workers of the oil industry.
Quite a story behind this important day, but as we've already heard much about Iran's oil industry, but not so much about its petrochemical sector. Tell us a little bit about that, if you may. What is it exactly? What is it? What are our feedstock and products? How has it grown over the past 4 decades since the victory of the Islamic Republic?
Thank you. That's a very technical question. And in order to shed light on the growth dimensions of the growth of the oil industry, that's a fundamental question. Speaking of our oil and gas reserves, total reserves, if you convert it to oil barrels, that's the biggest reserve amongst all world countries. And therefore, such reserves can be quite supportive for our petrochemical industry. If you do not have the necessary feedstock, then the feedstock seller may just get engaged in tender, and this will stop your industry. That's exactly what happened in Europe last year. So we have major oil and gas reserves. We have the gas and liquid feedstock, but on the day of the victory of the revolution, the statistics show that we had 1.5 million barrels, 1.5 million of petrochemical products, Uh, I can refer to PVC polymer that were produced by Abadan refinery and also Mahshar refinery, and also other major products such as methanol. So after 44 years, we are celebrating Nowruz, and I can give this good news to all Iranians, across the globe, that we have exceeded the 92 million tons, 1.5 million tons production in 1979. It has reached 93 million tons today. This is a source of pride, and we have been under sanctions during all these years. In 1979, we had limited petrochemical products, but today we have over 550 grades of different petrochemical and polymer products. Even though we went through 8 years of war, and 2 years before the war, there were activities for disintegration, and also we had that was before the war, and after the war we had to go through the reconstruction phase. But you see that due to the efforts made today, we have reached approximately 93 million tons. It was always said that the oil industry is under sanctions, various restrictions were imposed upon us, but despite all these, we have reached this major figure. I'm pleased to announce that based on the 7th and 8th development plans, we are going to double the existing capacities with respect to our petrochemical products. Of course, in the early days of the victory of the revolution, we were dependent on various sectors, even though we were in charge of the oil industry when the foreign advisors left the country. But we were dependent in the field of catalysts, and we were dependent in the field of the licenses, and also in the field of designing, execution, and making operational and even maintenance. We were not self-sufficient in these said areas, but today, on the eve of Nowruz, I can announce that, speaking of design, execution, and making operational and also maintenance, we have no dependency today. We have become 100% self-sufficient.
Iran marks the 72nd anniversary of the nationalization of its oil industry, which was a significant step in the country's independence from the West. On March 20th, 1951, members of the Iranian parliament passed a bill introduced by the country's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. The initiative made Iran the first country in West Asia to reclaim its oil industry from colonial powers. In retaliation, Britain and the United States imposed sanctions against Iran's oil sector and later colluded to stage a coup against the ex-premier's government in 1953. The CIA declassified documents of the incident in 2013, confirming Washington's footprints in the military overthrow of the Mossadegh administration.
On March 20,
democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. The initiative made Iran the first country in West Asia to reclaim its oil industry from colonial powers. In retaliation, Britain and the United States imposed sanctions against Iran's oil sector and later colluded to stage a coup against the ex-premier's government in 1953. The CIA declassified documents of the incident in 2013, confirming Washington's footprints in the military overthrow of the Mossadegh administration.
On March 20th, 1951, members of the Iranian parliament passed a bill introduced by the then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to nationalize the oil industry. Mossadegh received support from his nationalist party and religious groups, led by prominent cleric Ayatollah Kashani, for the initiative. The legislation put an end to 4 decades of British control on Iran's oil, which was conducted by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Britain used to pay only a small share of the oil excavations and exports to the Iranian government before the nationalization of Iran's oil industry.
3 important factors were involved in the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. The first factor was the national convergence towards this issue. The second factor was the strong bond among the nation, religious groups, and the Nationalist Party. The third was the rivalries among the so-called big powers of the time.
Following the nationalization of the oil industry in Iran, the US and Britain imposed international sanctions on Tehran in the early 1950s, which eventually saw the then Prime Minister Mossadegh out after an orchestrated coup against his government. Experts believe the nationalization of Iran's oil industry was one of the main reasons behind the 1953 Anglo-American coup, which overthrew the then Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The coup saw the formation of an absolute US-backed monarchy under Iran's last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was overthrown by the 1979 Islamic Revolution. A few years ago, the US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, published for the first time a document confirming Washington's role in the 1953 coup against the democratically elected government of Mossadegh.
The tangible benefits the United States gained from overthrowing Iran's elected government included a share of Iran's oil wealth, because before the nationalization of the oil industry, Britain was the only user of Iran's oil wealth.
Iran is the first country in the Middle East which has proclaimed the nationalization of the oil industry. The event is not only significant in the history of the Iranian nation's anti-colonialist campaign, but is a defining moment in the history of the political developments of the Middle East. Saman Kujuri, Press TV, Tehran.
And we'll be back with more news.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About
the
each
whole
other?
notion of logic.
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're going to leave here without them?
The whole notion
Run off
of
from
logic.
some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably
whole
logical
notion of
and
logic.
analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, Approvable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Yeah!